Hello, everybody. Welcome again to another edition of the MCHD Paramedic Podcast. This is Dr. Casey Patrick, and joining me today is my medical director, Rob Dickson.
Hello, all.
And today we've got a special episode. This is episode number 100 of the MCHD Paramedic Podcast. And realistically, take me back to almost 3 years ago over in conference room 101 when we recorded Syncope. I never envisioned recording episode 100, to be perfectly honest. And along the way, we've definitely made some mistakes, learned from them, really gained some, real positive aspects of recording this podcast, and really gotten some positive feedback. So all in all, me personally, I'm super proud of the product that we produced, and really want to take this episode today to do a couple things. First of all, talk through some of those lessons that we learned. Secondly, talk about some of the most popular episodes and what the take-home points are. If you're a listener of the podcast, you know that no matter who we have on, whether it's a guest, whether it's me yapping solo, or our clinical department folks here, we always tend to wrap up with the take-home points. So we're going to have the take-home points of the first 100 episodes, and then thank the folks that are responsible for making this thing happen, and talk a little bit about the future.
Yeah, I think it's a great story. A great place to start, Casey, is talk to the listeners about how this thing came about. Like, I'm in awe of the clinical group here and Dr. Patrick, and how this thing, I'm just blown away at the quality in 100 episodes. But it grew out of our initial epic failures.
Yes.
Talk about that.
So I'm going on my 5-year anniversary here at MCHD as the assistant medical director, which 5 years has definitely flown by. But the original reason for the hiring up front was we need to add on to our non-mandatory educational offerings here at the district, and that was my task. I didn't have a task beyond that. So being a classic med school 20 years ago sort of person, I'm used to sitting in a lecture hall with somebody reading off some slides, which we know now probably is fairly ineffective from an educational standpoint, but that's where we started 5 years ago. We went around and talked to some of the medics, the field crews, and said, hey, what are you missing? What do you want to talk about? And we got inevitably, CHF, COPD, diabetes, what happens when folks get to the hospital, those sort of classic questions. So I put together a CHF, COPD lecture that was 60 slides long, 70 slides long, spent hours and hours and hours putting it together, and we had 17 folks show up. And we're like, that stinks. That's not great. 17 out of 250. And so let's do diabetes 2 months later. So we put diabetes on the calendar, did some advertising, tried to come up with some Starbucks gift cards and other stuff to give out. And we did 60 or 70 diabetes slides, and 20 people showed up. And this seemed to be the same repeat 20 each couple months. And each couple months I put this together, I got more and more frustrated. This was, I felt like, the county taxpayers are paying my salary here. I was concerned that, hey, we're not getting out of this what we should. This is not a good return on investment. How can I improve this to the point where people want to come? How can we get better value out of this as a service? It's not, I guess there was part of me that was like, people don't want to come hear me talk, but I don't know that I blame them on that one. But just, how can we do better for our medics? 17 to 20, we're shooting, less than 10%. And that's not a knock on the people that didn't come, because one day I was driving home after being really frustrated, sitting down in Chief Anderson's office at the time and just ranting about what can we do here? This is not working out. This is 12, 18 months into this job, and people aren't coming to these programs. What can we do? And he didn't have any, great answers. He talked me off the ledge and said, just keep working, keep plugging along, we'll figure it out. And on the way home, I turned on MRAP or MCRET or, some EM-based podcast and listened to some airway management discussion. And it was about 2/3 of my short drive home when the bell went off. And I said, if it's a Tuesday and I don't have a shift and there's an airway lecture at the hospital, I don't physically drive to the hospital on my day off. We need to try to reach medics on their own time, on their own convenience, in a flexible manner. And that's really where it grew out of. I walked back into the office the next day and said, hey, I think we need to have a EMS, ground base, core clinical concept podcast that is the medical directors talking to the medics based on their questions, our QI/QA, our educational focus for that quarter, and let's make this relevant to them. And they can do it on their way to work. They can do it while they're working out. They can do it, while they're getting ready for work in the morning. Let's take it to them rather than asking them to come to us.
Yeah, and it's just, I think phenomenally been a great product, Casey. What if you had to kind of go back and go over the big lesson learned, the top ones? What would you change now? What do you wish you would have known then?
Well, some of these have grown out of questions. I've been asked this question by folks in other services. I'm thinking about a podcast. What do you need to do, or how do you need to approach it? And realistically, to get to episode 100, consistency is key. Don't bite half the cake. Take small portions. If you have the bandwidth for an episode every month or every 2 months, then don't set an episode for every week. You're going to let down your listeners' expectations there. And how much bandwidth you have to produce episodes depends on your specific situation. Here we started out weekly trying to build an audience, and that was way too much. I was losing sleep and ragged trying to get an episode ready every week. We've really found a pretty happy medium here at every 2 weeks. Some folks do every month, do longer episodes. There's all kinds of ways to do it. There's not one right way, but your way needs to be consistent, whatever that is. For me personally, I listen to a lot of medical and non-medical podcasts out there, as listeners do, so I'm sure y'all have your favorites as well. I'm not a comedian. We don't have the staff available and the staff time available to edit in, sound clips and to spend hours and hours and hours editing. So one of the things that I realized early on is I couldn't overstretch myself with the podcast, because there's still run reviews, there's still budget meetings, there's still hospital meetings, there's still QI/QA and weekly quality meetings to attend. I can't have everybody's focus on the podcast and then nobody doing any of the other Department of Clinical Services work. So really keeping it simple is very important. You need to talk to your audience, figure out who your audience is, and make sure what you're giving them is what they want. And I'm sure the MCHD listeners out there probably have episodes they prefer to others, and some of them may look at a topic and be like, this is not for me. But realistically, almost every episode, save a few that were my babies, were topics that came from the medics themselves. And, in an EMS service of 250 paramedics, we got folks with all kinds of varied interests. So we've had all kinds of varied episodes, from community outreach to, first responder type topics to, to journal club reviews, to pharmacology reviews, to, guest speakers, things like that. But if you're producing a podcast that is primarily based around your interest, you may end up being the only listener. And so from our standpoint, and we had this discussion a long time before we got started, realistically, we wanted to take us as the medical directors and extend ourselves in a way that folks can hear us talk and hear our clinical and medical philosophical approach more easily, as opposed to having to come to our office, which nobody really wants to come to admin, right? They want to go to work their shift, and go home. And then don't let the perfection be the enemy of good. We've said that a lot through the podcast. We try to have consistent audio. That's key. Thank you, Andy Adams. The podcast wouldn't exist without Andy. I'll thank him 20 times during this episode, but he's been the behind-the-scenes editor and sound person and helped our audio be what it is. I'm super proud of our audio. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and I think ours stands up. But if you have hisses and scratches and audio drops, people just are going to lose interest pretty quickly. So make sure you figure out how you're going to do your audio. There's millions of ways to do it. Again, just like your content and your release schedule, you got to be consistent there. And then, again, be open to ideas from the entire team. Some of the episodes that I thought were super duds have been the most popular, and there have been topics that have been pushed from folks here in the office, that have wanted to, I got an idea about this, and I don't think that's a good idea. Don't say that out loud. Supportive. We produce it, make it happen, and then it, takes off like wildfire. So, again, listen to your folks around you, be open to ideas, be consistent, and do what you can within the confines of the other duties that you have in your job description. Along the way, there's been surprises, right? We've hit some things that we probably didn't expect. Tell the listeners some of the things that you've seen kind of, I don't know, some of these things have popped up kind of organically. We've said we probably need to talk about this. Can we do it on the podcast? Can we get it turned around quickly? What are some of the...
we turned it around today. I mean, the podcast was really the kind of the core curriculum of EM and EMS medicine, and it really morphed to what it is, the 100 episodes it is now. A couple of examples of kind of on the fly, just in time education was measles. We had a big measles outbreak in the county, and I was not an expert on measles. But we did some background research and we put out a podcast. I think it was like that week, within a week for sure, really within days of this outbreak, to try to outreach not only to our employees but to the community. That's just one example of all the COVID. I mean, now we're, as you can see, we're masked, and we're right at shy of a year of COVID. I believe we've done 3 COVID podcasts, 3 or 4.
Feels like 300.
Feels like 300, but it's really great for just in time. If anything COVID has taught all of us is that it's rapidly changing, and just like EM medicine, you have to evolve with it. You have to evolve with those changes in clinical guidelines, changes in the way we approach these patients, changes in the way we manage their respiratory failure. So I think it's been an excellent tool. One of the other really beneficial things that we found is it's really been great for recruiting. We've had podcast listeners that are now podcast listening employees, which I think is great and great for the service. The other things would be is how we get the ideas. I mean, Casey, behind you can't see it, but we have the idea board and the outline complete board and the needs editing board. But really, and initially when we started this, I thought, oh my gosh, we're going to have, an episode every 2 weeks. We're going to run out of stuff to talk about, and it's really kind of endless because it's very ground based. It comes from the service up, and there's always ideas being emailed, and someone will shoot you a text about a case they had, and then we'll start talking about it in the office, and poof, we've got another podcast topic. So it's really been good for that. I think the last would be is that it's a great repository for our own education. We use it for to keep people current, to remediate as medical directors when we see an educational gap. We use it to go back and re-educate on those specific topics. So it's really a great core curriculum of EM medicine, which is what it was intended to be.
I truly underestimated how much use we would get out of the material after the fact. I envisioned it as this podcast is recorded, released, people listen to it over a 4-week, 6-week span, and it sort of goes by the wayside.
Yeah.
And we found ourselves through run reviews, through remediation, through new hire, through even interactions with the hospital systems. If you want to hear what we're doing, check out episode 46.
If you want to know the way that the medics are trained to approach a COVID airway, you can listen to it.
Yep, check it out.
Takes 20 minutes.
If you're interested in the link, we'll send you the link. And so it's been a real nice tool to share with others, and that includes employees, community partners, even community members. So it's been pretty excellent.
So if I had to get you, I know you hate it when I tap the table. Can I do a drum roll? Can you go over the top 10 or top 20, top podcasts?
Drum roll.
That was a very good drum roll.
There's a drum roll. So Andy may edit that. So
okay.
Again, thanks Andy for all your editing and taking my oohs and uhs out of there. So top 10 in honor of my favorite late night host, Dave Letterman. We've done some top 10s recently, so keep bringing up Letterman. I wish I had a beard like him now. He's got a pretty crazy beard. But we wanted to just let y'all know what the top 10 most listened to episodes are. All 4 of the serial killers are on the top 10. Chest pain is 1, shortness of breath is 2, shortness of breath is 3, mental status is 5, and abdominal pain 6. So all the serial killers were really well received. In all honesty, they're probably the core
Makes
of
me happy,
the podcast itself. Yeah,
it's kind of how it evolved. But when you came up with the idea, and I can't remember which one of the guys you guys were talking it around, how this idea, this way to approach it. But it's really brilliant. I love the serial killer series. I wish we would have started with that, because it's really to the core of what we ask the medics to do out there every day, which is to take these horribly undifferentiated, difficult patients in austere circumstances and narrow that differential down to the top 5 killers for that particular chief complaint.
we'll definitely hit those in the take-home points. I will say that I disagree with you. I don't disagree with my medical director very often in public. We try to have a unified front, but I'm going to disagree and say that episodes 79, 80, 81, and 82 gave me 78 before that to screw up and improve on, so that those were actually listenable. So I'm saying that having those further down the line was a total benefit for all you listeners out there. So what other ones? Back to the Basics, COPD, episode 48, way back. Yeah, that one has really stayed one of the more popular ones, and I'm going to tie these together here in a bit as to why I think these are the case. People love Chris Call. Everybody loves Chris Call. If you've ever met Chris, he's one of the more positive and dynamic individuals that I know in EMS, and just a leader and someone that you just feel better after you talk to Chris or you listen to Chris. So Chris and I talked about stupidity in EMS, and that has been one of the definite favorites. That was a bit of a circuitous route to an episode, but I really liked that one. I didn't like the way it recorded. I thought that the conversation could have went better. I didn't like how I sounded, but man, people loved it. So
I really liked it.
I've gotten over that.
I really liked it, even though I thought, and we talked beforehand, the title, initially when I read the script, I was like, what are you guys doing? This is so off-putting and insulting, and but have a listen to the podcast. I love that one. Love Chris Call. Very, very great medic, good guy, and it's a good listen.
And then the last 3, Art of the Airway, middle, number 50. Art of the Airway is one of the ones that I felt like you and I probably meshed better on that episode than some of the earlier ones. I was proud of that one when it came out. A really good, not textbook airway discussion, but more case-based, a little more nuanced, because I think we talk about the airway extremes a lot of the times, but what about the tweeners, where you really have to make those tough decisions on sedation, on airway choice. Sometimes we deal in the extremes in the lecture setting and in the educational setting, but in reality we have a lot more gray area. So I was proud of that episode. Episode 74, COVID-19 updates. We've had, Dr. Dickson did 3 COVID episodes. I feel like 103. I feel like we talked about COVID nonstop for the last year, but it's definitely been something that's been in the forefront, so not a shocker that people have listened to that one. And then lastly, one of the more recent ones, episode 88, entitled CO2 Basics. And that really was a bread and butter EMS discussion of how that waveform helps us and why it's important and why it needs to be really one of the bedrock foundations of our clinical care. So that's the top 10 with, actually I missed
You forgot, Doctor.
I forgot number 10. Number 10 was episode 3, syncope.
Number 3, so he was still like stuttering and sweating. He's still sweating from episode 3. It was really a good podcast.
It was. I was so nervous about hearing my own voice. So episode 3 still holding in the top 10 slot. I guess I'm kind of proud that it's lingered that long.
No, it's great.
So let's run through some of the take-homes of those top 10. I think it's probably the cornerstones of the podcast. If you're a listener at all, what are the things we want you to know? Take out there on the street when you're taking care of patients tomorrow night. And starting with the serial killers, you led into that earlier and alluded to it. Realistically, the whole idea is for you to take these common calls, these calls that have the killers mixed in with the totally benign. But we're charged with finding those killers. how do we approach those? And realistically, if you run on a chest pain, you run on abdominal pain, you run on a shortness of breath patient, in your mind on the way to the call, have these serial killers in mind. And what are they? Let's review them real quick, right? Chest pain, it's got 5. MI, we always get in that EKG. PE, think about clear lungs, chest pain, PE risk factors. Pneumothorax, use your stethoscope every now and then. Pericardial tamponade, think about electrical alternans, sinus tachycardia, low voltage on the EKG. And then thoracic aortic dissection, right? That ripping, tearing, migrating pain from the chest and the back down into the abdomen, unequal pulses, Marfan syndrome. There's some killer risk factors there. So chest pain, number 1. Number 2, altered mental status. Infection, both systemic sepsis and meningitis, encephalitis. Endocrine, that's the woke you up.
Blood glucose, blood glucose, blood glucose, every patient, every time with altered mental status.
Right.
Can't say it enough.
Stroke, we talk a lot about stroke. There's enough stroke podcasts if you can get your stroke education right here with us. Then tox, obviously ingestion, alcohol, opiates being probably the number 1, number 2 there, but there are plenty of others. And then seizures. Don't underestimate the post-ictal state, we're going to have to delete that, Andy. Sorry.
Don't forget the post-ictal state.
Edit at 21:30. If you'll write that down for me, Misty, and we'll go again. And lastly, don't forget seizures, right? That post-ictal state can look just like altered mental status. What about shortness of breath? Take shortness of breath.
COPD asthma, right? CHF, non-pulmonary acidosis. They have tachypnea. Doesn't mean that it's a primary pulmonary problem. How about DKA, other things that cause tachypnea? Infarction, right? Can never forget about infarctions and PEs. So we'll dig into, if you listen to the series, I love COPD because it really differentiates. We were talking in the office today about one of the biggest mistakes is kind of thinking those are the same entity when COPD is the chronic destruction. These are people whose lungs in the interim are never going to be back to normal, whereas the asthmatic is a reversible inflammatory process with bronchoconstriction and inflammation that is theoretically fully reversible, and in between they have normal-ish lungs, whereas the COPD destroyed, never going to work properly.
So let me add 2 points in there. I typed this out. COPD is chronic destruction causing obstruction.
I love that.
It came out last night, and I'm like, that's kind of cheesy, but I like it. So,
chronic destruction causing obstruction.
All right, so it's not inflammatory like asthma. And also, you had your chance there to throw in your little jab at me because I wanted to include PE on shortness of breath. I didn't want to include MI. And then you came up with the simple way of saying, how about we just say infarction? So both myocardial infarction and pulmonary infarction on that shortness of breath killers, which is, especially in elderly, diabetic, females. We want to get EKGs in all our shortness of breath patients because that can be an anginal equivalent sign of MI. And then lastly, abdominal pain, AAA, right? Masquerades as kidney stones, right?
Yeah.
That flank pain in a hypotensive elderly gentleman with vascular disease, that's AAA until proven otherwise. Torsion, both of the testicle and the ovary, so twisting of the testicle or the ovary on its pedicle. Bowel perforation is a killer, so think about patients with peptic ulcer disease risk, people with GI bleed history. Then ruptured ectopic pregnancy, so any female of childbearing age with tachycardia and hypotension is an ectopic until proven otherwise. And then ischemia also on the abdominal pain side, and that can be bowel ischemia, but also cardiac ischemia. Again, that can sneak in there as epigastric pain, and make sure we're getting EKGs in all those epigastric pain patients as well. So there's your serial killer reviews. Talked a little bit about COPD in there. Again, remember, BiPAP, bronchodilators, assuming it's allowed in COVID one day. Get your end-tidal tracing, look for your shark fin pattern. And MAG, steroids, those are kind of second-line players. Remember, there's no role for epinephrine in COPD, just in asthma. So it's important to make that differential delineation so that you're treating properly.
Right, and that is one of the big errors that we see in our own service is that we have COPD patients which potentially are older, frailer, and could be harmed by epinephrine, even though it's would be unusual in an IM form, which is the only way we give it here. But it's still potentially dangerous for those patients. So remember, COPD, chronic destruction causing obstruction, stay away from the epinephrine. In the sickest asthmatic, it's life-saving, right? IM epinephrine, consider magnesium, early non-invasive support for those patients.
And don't forget your COPD chameleons. Get an EKG, listen to your lung sounds, right? It can be an MI, it could be a pneumothorax, right? People with big COPD bulla pop those bulla. And when they pop those bulla, they get short of breath. And if you don't listen to the lung sounds, you may put on that BiPAP mask and roll onto the hospital, and then you've really got a double whammy, but you've got positive pressure on a pneumothorax patient. So don't forget your stethoscope. I know it's a prop most of the time. Sorry, it's the truth. But in this patient, it's really, really important. And then always, always, always consider PE risks. If you don't ask about them, you're never going to think about it.
I'm going to pitch the next one to you, Dr. Patrick, because this is you and Chris's, but go over some of the stupid risks in this profession. I mean, our profession is fraught with unseen perils and landmines everywhere to step on, but talk about some of those specific things to avoid.
And I would urge everyone to go back and take a look at that podcast. Even if you don't listen to the podcast, take a look at the show notes and take a look at the blog post that it was derived from, because it's two financial guys talking about stupidity, and it fits EMS, emergency medicine, to a T. And basically, stupidity is making bad decisions with all the necessary information for you to make good decisions staring you in the face. That's the best way that I could sum it up. And we all do those as emergency providers sometimes. So what are the risk factors and how we mitigate those? Well, don't rush, right? Smooth and slow is our goal, right? Rely on checklists. It doesn't all have to be up here all the time. Use your team, be confident, delegate, sift and sort that information, and concentrate on the objective findings that are most important. And then, beware and respect fatigue, right? Beware of and respect fatigue. We know that it's part of our job. We know we work nights, we work weekends, we work holidays, 24-hour shifts. Use your downtime wisely. Use your days off wisely. Get sleep, get exercise, watch your diet, get some exercise. Those sort of simple things that we all know, but they're important for how we function on shift.
Couldn't agree more, Casey. Couldn't agree more.
What about our airway management episode? Sum that up for us in a couple sentences. That was one of my favorites still.
It really is, and this is kind of a Jeff Jar. We had Jeff on early in the podcast, but we really stole this topic from him of this whole concept of delayed sequence intubation, or as Casey said in his last little piece on some of the pitfalls, is to slow down the process. That's the problem with the concept of RSI, is that everybody rushes through everything, and then stuff gets dropped on the floor of the truck, and then you try to find a piece of emergency equipment, but it's not set up right. So preparation is key. Slow things down, preparation, get the patient prepped properly, and get them in the safest pre-intubation, pre-sedation, pre-paralysis state that you can possibly get them in. So hard stops for hypoxemia, right? We don't paralyze hypoxic patients. It's fraught with peril. Hypotension in patients, address it before you paralyze them and intubate them. These things that we know, when we slow the process down, patients do better, and it's a safer environment for them.
But what about if we have to use a supraglottic airway? Isn't that a failed airway, doctor?
And that's another one that we kind of got, I think, from an Eagles talk, which is I hate the concept. I know the Twitter folks out there are going to be like throwing spears at me, but this whole idea in EM and EMS medicine of measuring success by first pass success of a tracheal tube, to me, is insane, right? I love DASH, which is definitive airway, sans hypoxia, which means that we did what we set out to do. We placed some airway in the patient, and while we were doing it, they didn't die is a complication of the procedure we were trying to complete. So I think that that's the most important, is slow down enough to make sure that you mind those hard stops, you mind the physiology of the patient, and you set up that safety net, nasal cannula aptic oxygenation, proper pre-ox, proper minding of their blood pressure and their blood oxygen parameters before we paralyze the patient, right? Remember, sedation's your friend. Sometimes we need ketamine or some type of sedative for control. We have a thrashing hypoxic patient in a medical or traumatic delirium. We need control first. So I'm not anti-sedating them beforehand, but after we sedate them, let's slow the process down, NPOP airway, make sure the patient is optimized before we complete the procedure and paralyze.
That's the delay in a nutshell, right? You separate the sedation from the paralysis and you resuscitate before you intubate. That's one of the more common sayings out there. You optimize that blood pressure, you optimize your oxygenation. It buys you time for visualization and it prevents peri-intubation arrest. So many of these patients, back when I trained, when everything was RSI, and that rapid was the killer word in there, because we just said what when they arrested with intubation? Oh, they were super sick, right? They were just super sick. Well, they might have been super sick, but they would have been less likely to arrest if you didn't make them hypoxic, bradycardic, and hypotensive during your intubation attempt by paralyzing them. So that episode was a real nice summary of our airway approach here at MCHD, and thankfully the listeners really kind of grabbed onto that one and liked it. COVID-19, we're not going to no COVID discussion today. Syncope, hey, that was a long time ago, but I still remember my mnemonic last night without looking it up, so it must mean it's useful.
Even I know it now. I've stole Dr. Patrick's slide, so I know the syncope mnemonic. CRAPS, so cardiac structural abnormality, ruptures, AAA, right?
Ectopic, yep.
Ectopic, I forgot ectopic. A, arrhythmia. S, subarachnoid hemorrhage. And P, pulmonary embolus.
Right, so EKG is going to be key. EKG covers that A, so get an EKG in every syncopal patient you take care of every time. And then lastly, Entitled CO2, that one wasn't too long ago. Look for that shark fin. That tells you it's obstructive disease straight away.
Talk about the most important tracing that we care about here. If you only have to remember one, please know this one.
If you have an Entitled of 40 and you insert an endotracheal tube into a patient and it goes 40, 30, 20, 10, 5, 0 in a stepwise fashion, you have one thing and one thing only to do, and that is remove the tube from the esophagus and rescue your airway, period. And that end-tidal decline is going to happen quicker than hypoxia, because the hypoxia is going to be delayed. Why? Because you pre-oxygenated well, right? So take that tube out and take attempt 2, or fall back to plan B, or whatever your rescue device is, or your next step is going to be, period, the end. So that's really our take-home points. We're going to wrap it up with some thanks and future ideas. And realistically, I wanted to give some thanks out there to some of our repeat guests, folks we've had on more than once: Dr. Peter Antevy, Jeff Jarvis, Dr. Jerry Snow, Dr. Dan O'Donnell, Chris Call's been on a couple times and is a favorite, Dr. Kevin Schultz from down at HFD, and then Dr. Al Meyer from all the way on the other side of the world in Australia. He has the best accent of anyone on the MCHD Paramedic Podcast. Repeat medic performers: Jordan Anderson, Kevin Crocker, Ashton Herring, Lee Gillum, Brad Ward, and Sean Simmons. Special thanks to each of them. They get suckered in here with a happy face over and over and over again by yours truly. So thank you all for putting up with my business. Missy Willingham's off the camera over here, and she's been responsible for all of our social media presence. So thanks to Missy. I can't thank Andy Adams enough. He's really been the master of this whole thing and making sure that we sound okay and we have all the supplies that we need, and really taking the tech side of it and making it happen. So none of this would be possible without Andy. Thanks to the Department of Clinical Services here, the MCHD admin. I've had continuous support for this project since day one. Wouldn't have made it out of the clinical chief's office as nothing other than a crazy idea unless Jordan Anderson 3 years ago had said, that might work. Let's see what we can do. So thanks to Jordan for being the initial support, and Dr. Dickson, Randy Johnson, both have been continuously supportive of every weird and surprising variation of this thing. So thank you all for that. And then most importantly, thanks to the listeners. I don't know that we'd have kept going if we didn't have some listeners out there. So especially the MCHD medics that have listened over time and not got sick of us. Thank you for listening, and hopefully this has been helpful in your educational journey for sure.
Yeah, I hope to continue this in perpetuity. Who knows where it's going to go, but I have thoroughly enjoyed being a guest and really watching the podcast evolve to what it's in. I'm super proud, Casey, of this product that you guys have brought forth, and I think it's really a gift to the EMS community. So appreciate all your work and all the people that have supported you here in the Department of Clinical Services. So job well done.
Thank you. Those are awful kind words. I appreciate them all. Where we're going, I've got some ideas. As you can see, this will be episode probably number 2 or number 3 that we've posted on our YouTube channel. So we're going to try to double dip and provide some additional content to the YouTube channel, so you get to see where we actually record it and what we look like and why we're podcast stars and not movie stars. We're gonna try to bump up the Apple reviews. Our Apple reviews right now are hovering around 140. So if you're listening out there, I always say leave a review. If you want to leave a review, go to Apple and leave one. I'd like to get our reviews up to 200. That'd be a cool number. I just pulled it out of thin air and made it a goal for 2021. We have potential educational collaborations on the horizon that really have some potential with some of our local EM residencies, some of our local medical schools, even neighboring services. Who knows where we'll be able to go in the future there. We really want to focus on continued consistency. In the end, we want to give you a product that's useful and respectful of your time. That's really continuing goal number 1, is not to waste anybody's time, to give you something that helps you in your medical practice, in your EMS career, and again, is something that you finish up with and say, I got a take-home point or 2. That's really the end goal for me every single time we put together one of these outlines. So anything else you want to add before we wrap up?
Yeah, and on that note, if you have an idea for a show, something you thought about that you haven't seen on the cast, something that we can expound on here, drop us an email at the podcast email, podcast@mchd-tx.org. We appreciate your reviews and all your comments.
Yeah, thanks everyone for listening. We'll see you soon for episode 101. And then who knows, 3 years from now, maybe we'll be at 200. Thanks everybody for listening. Have a good rest of your afternoon, morning, or evening.